Hello, everyone. Welcome to the YouTube introductions to Bach cantatas, especially those at the series at Grace Lutheran Church in River Forest. My name is Mark Bangert, and I will be guiding you through this introduction. And it's an introduction to cantata number 6, Bleib bei uns. It's a cantata, just briefly to give you some lexical information. It's a cantata that was first heard on April 2nd, 1725, which happened to be Easter Monday, and we'll say a little bit more about that later. It's scored for SATB choir and alto, tenor, and bass soloists, together with probably a choir at his time of boys that sang a chorale melody. I think when you hear it next week, you'll hear sopranos from the choir sing that particular part. It's scored for strings as well, and a choir of oboes, that is 2 regular oboes and then an oboe da caccia, which these days is generally played on an English horn. Makes for a rich sound. And then, interestingly enough, it also has a part for violoncello piccolo. And this is one of about 9 cantatas that Bach scored that instrument for. And last time I introduced a cantata, that was also one cantata in which the violoncello piccolo played. So that's the scoring. And the structure of the cantata is that it begins with a chorus, rather luxurious chorus, followed by an aria, and then that's followed by a chorale setting, which is an extended chorale setting similar to the well-known Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. And then that's followed by a brief recitative and an aria, and then a final chorale. So there are sort of 3 pillars to the cantata: the opening chorus, that middle extended chorale setting, and then the final chorale. I'd like to spend some time with the text because understanding how that text came to be and what it means helps an awful lot in hearing the cantata. First of all, it was written by an unknown librettist, which is so often the case with the cantatas. But one theory is that whoever it was probably a theologian, because it gets rather thick theologically at several points. For us, it kind of creates a theological disconnect. And here's the reason why. I'm recording this from my South Loop condo, and it's the 3rd Sunday of Easter. Those of us who predated the LBW with our Sunday worship, those of us of a certain age, remember a time when we counted the Sundays that followed Easter Day as after Easter. So it would be the first Sunday after Easter, second Sunday after Easter, and so on. When the LBW came out, the lectionary part of that particular book was built on the model that was developed by the Roman Catholics several years before. And there are some significant changes in terms of how to understand and view the church year. And this is one of them. That is, to think of Easter as being a 50-day period. 50 days of celebrating Easter. So every Sunday is of Easter. So the Easter festivities actually extend all the way out 50 days until Pentecost, which means 50 days. And it was at Pentecost then that we learned from the books of Luke and Acts. It was at Pentecost that the church was born. So we're dealing with a period here between the resurrection and Pentecost of approximately 50 days, when the focus in this new lectionary of ours is on the appearances of Christ and what his resurrection means. Nowadays, we talk then of the Sundays after Easter, or of Easter, excuse me. Prior to that time, and in Bach's time for sure, the counting was Sundays after Easter. And that particular development innocently gave permission to some people to shape those days however they liked. And that was true of some Lutherans particularly. So if you don't have the strong emphasis on the appearances of Christ, then you can do other things with these days. And they received an assist from a Lutheran liturgical habit that I think developed sometime in the 1600s. And that is that in larger urban centers, the three major festivals, Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, were celebrated for 3 days. So you had Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday on every one of those instances. And so the gospel lesson that was usually associated with the evening of Easter Day, that is the Emmaus disciples' gospel, was moved to Monday, Monday after Easter, which is then why Bach wrote this cantata on Luke 24:29, which is the story of the Emmaus disciples. So that helps a little bit to understand how the case was for Bach's librettist and for Bach himself to focus on things other than specific Easter appearances and so on. Without the of and the focus on after, biblical interpreters at the time could venture out then and focus on different things that were in these Easter narratives. So, for instance, as far as this particular gospel is concerned, biblical interpreters sort of allegorically addressed the text, and they took things like, "Stay with us, for it is evening." They interpreted that to mean, you better hang around, don't abandon us, don't leave us here by ourselves. And they were referring, of course, to our own time, or their own time, their contemporary time. Or another example would be the other part of that text is, "Stay with us, for evening is approaching." And they didn't figure that they needed to spend any time with the weather report, and developed theories that those words actually referred to the darkness that has invaded our lives, the darkness of sin and so on. So the texts take a little different turn rather than focusing on the Easter event. Preaching tradition, therefore, at Bach's time, sort of demanded that preachers on Easter Monday, when they addressed this text, would focus on the darkness of sin, the derelict lives that Christians and others were living, and the general situation of the world around. And they would rather focus on the exhortation that was embedded in all of that to improve your life and to live it in such a way that Christ would not abandon us in our particular time. One of Bach's favorite authors was August Pfeiffer. I think he had 4 or 5 of his books in Bach's library. And August Pfeiffer, when talking about this time after Easter Day, particularly Easter Monday, referred to it as the evening of the world. That is, the fact that the world is getting dark and will therefore lose its existence, and focused on the judgment of the end time. So that was what was to happen on Easter Monday in terms of preaching and meditating on those days. So in Leipzig, the 50 days of Easter were not so much about thinking of the appearances of Christ and the various facets of the Easter story itself, but rather they focused on the notion of exhortation and helping people repent and to recognize that there was a great deal of darkness around them and that they better pay attention to that. The good news was quite simple, and that was that they did admit that God would not leave them, Christ would not leave them, because we always had the Word and Sacrament, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, Christ would be present as those means of the Spirit. The suddenness of all of this is quite astounding, however, and can be illustrated by thinking about the 24 hours in Leipzig that encapsulated both Easter Day and Easter Monday. On Easter Day in 1725, by the way, we should mention that a little over a week before Easter Monday in 1725, Bach had presented his first revision of the St. John Passion. So his head was into St. John Passion still. And then on Easter Day, the day before this cantata was presented, he gave his first performance of the Easter Oratorio, which is a marvelous piece sort of rehearsing the Easter story with trumpets and drums and whatnot. And then less than 24 hours later, he writes this cantata, or he presents this cantata, which has a rather dark text. So the suddenness, the change, has been noted by many, many authors, and Eric Chafe, for one, has also pointed out that the Easter Oratorio, it was in D major, very bright key, and the key that Bach usually chose for all of his festival pieces with trumpets and drums. Whereas the key for this particular cantata, Bleib, denn, is C minor, kind of a dark key, the key that Bach focused on in the St. John Passion, actually. So that gives you a little bit of a background in terms of how people were thinking, particularly the preachers and those people that were involved with planning worship, and the expectations of others who came to these worship services. Let's now take a look at the trajectory of the text of the cantata, how it moves from one idea to the next. It starts with this luxurious chorus, which is nothing else than the words from the Emmaus story. Stay with us, for the evening is coming, and the night is about ready to fall for us, or fall around us. And Bach sets us in a very massive, kind of wonderful way. Then the aria moves to the thought, it's a prayerful thought, to God to not abandon us, to not stay, to not move away, but to stay, especially with all of the darkness that is around about us. The third movement then is this sort of expanded chorale setting, and that's the theological mood of that is along the same lines that we've been saying. First of all, stanza 1, it's a two-stanza chorale, by the way. And stanza 1, the thought is remain, don't let your word, that is our light, be extinguished. And then that's followed by stanza 2, which goes on to say, during this final troubled time, give us steadfastness to your word and to hold true to both word and sacrament. Stanza 1 was written by Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's partner through the entire Reformation, and was a powerful lay theologian during those years. Philip Melanchthon took this text from Luke on Stay With Us, and he turned it into Latin couplets, which were then later translated into German. And that hymn then, that kind of German hymn that was authored by Melanchthon, was added to by another Lutheran theologian whose name was Nicholas Selnecker. And Selnecker added 7 more verses carrying the thought of what Melanchthon had done even further, and particularly focusing on the darkness of sin and such. Selnecker is an interesting character because he was both a musician and a theologian. He was a fine organist and was employed for a while as an organist. And then after graduating from the University of Wittenberg, where he had Melanchthon as a teacher, he began to take over pastorates here and there, and ended up in Leipzig as a pastor at St. Thomas. So this hymn has a kind of close connection to St. Thomas in Leipzig. We know the hymn, those of us who have Missouri Synod background, from our use in the Lutheran hymnal and then later the Lutheran service book, where the hymn is entitled, Lord Jesus Christ, with us abide. And all 8 stanzas are in that hymn in those 2 books. So that hymn, in a sense, is sort of the spark for the whole cantata, because it does pick up on this notion of darkness and also the notion of staying and remaining. That's followed then by a very short, we say secco, that is dry. It's a simply accompanied recitative, which is very dark in its mood. And it talks about the fact that the church has been darkened over many places. People don't lead Christian lives anymore, and therefore comes this interesting thought in the middle of nowhere. Therefore, you have knocked over the candlesticks. What? What does that mean? Where did that come from? Well, that comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 2, where the author of Revelation talks about the 8 major churches that were there in the Asian Minor, and he refers to them as candlesticks. And the one in Ephesus was having problems, and the writer of the book of Revelation says, you better behave or otherwise God will knock over your candlestick and you will not any longer exist and God will abandon you. So that's a sort of a way out reference that unless you know the scriptures extremely well, you don't know what this librettist was referring to with this particular notification. Then after that recitative, which is short, I think I mentioned that, comes a lovely aria, which is a prayer, which says, let your light, that is the word, continually shine over us and keep us off the way of sin. And then that's followed by a chorale, the final movement of the cantata, which is another prayer to God to bless the church, to keep it steadfast, and to keep it strong, and keep it witnessing to the gospel, so that it might praise you, that is God, in eternity. And this is all done with stanza 2 of Luther's famous hymn, Lord, keep us steadfast in your word. And it's a simple setting. Having said all that, we should do some musical markers. That is, some things that you might want to listen for. I'm going to try something new today because I've got a new piece of equipment, and I'm going to put up on a screen here the score and point some things out about the opening chorus. But to do that, I need to turn the computer, so bear with me here as we do that. And there is the score. Let's see if I can move this a little bit more closely. This is actually at about measure 20, where the choir comes in right here. And so you have about 19 measures before this, but what you see here is sort of repeated at the beginning, only in instrumental form. Some things to notice here. The choir sings in kind of a homophonic style, hymnic style. It's not very contrapuntal here. This happens frequently. These words are remain with us, Bleib bei uns. And the choir frequently alternates with instruments throughout the whole work. The first oboe imitates the soprano, and the second oboe does some things similar to the alto, and English horn plays tenor part and so on. So this is all sort of doubling what the choir is doing. But notice something here. The choir, the soprano, alto, and tenor all have trills together. And so do the instruments. And it happens here too. I think the tenor part trill got lost somewhere along the way, but the trills are there too. In some respects, you could look at this entire cantata as a sort of concerto for trills and orchestra. There are so many trills, and we'll have to think about what that might mean. The opening line of the soprano line, which is doubled here, is a falling interval. And this begins falling intervals that happen elsewhere. In fact, you can see them here, falling here too in the instrumental parts. We'll take a look at what it looks like in the choir in just a minute. And then together with all of that, all of the strings in unison are playing these G's. It's all sounding G. They're just repeated G's. What might that mean? I suspect what it means is that you're holding a note. And the rhythm, the eighth note, gives a little movement to the entire piece. That's a held note. Stay, remain, don't move. Stay right here. So then if we go a little bit lower here, we see the next part of this, and these strings are still playing that. Here they hold a note, they don't play repeated notes. But then starts a pattern here, which is falling. And the text is for night is coming upon us. So night is falling, and this becomes imitative now. Soprano, alto, tenor, bass following. And that kind of pattern follows all the way through this entire first movement. Now, the second part of the movement, which will require another sheet here. Hang on, I'm getting it right here. You can see how it moves to that. It happens, the second part starts right here in this measure. What's interesting is that there's a tempo change. It says andante, but it's at the same time cut time. So the movement sort of increases in speed. And it's also very contrapuntal. You see lots of activity going on here. And the feeling that you get from this second part, which is just repeating the words, it's the same text, but the feeling that you get from it is a kind of sense of urgency, insisting that you stay. So it's urgent that you don't leave. Remain with us. And that kind of is a way of saying what the text is focusing on, what the librettist is focusing on. Let's take a look at the first aria then, which would be the next movement. Oh, by the way, the second part of the cantata ends with a long-held note. It's It's a unison note from all the choir, and it's again Bleib, which means to stay. So here's and then it goes back to what the first part of the movement was about. This is now the first aria, and what is it that I want to show you here? I think I got the wrong side. I do. Here we go, where the voice comes in. This is scored, by the way, for English horn, alto voice, which is a very deep part. The tessitura lies quite low, with a simple kind of part underneath. Notice again the trills. We'll talk more about those, maybe not right away, but we'll try to help you understand what those are about, I think. Hochgelobter Gott, which is highly praised God. There's a movement up, which means high, and that's a little bit of tone painting there, which the English horn also has frequently. So there's that notion of highness, and that's a fervent kind of prayer. Later on in this movement, when she gets to the words darkness, then there's a movement downwards several times by whole steps, which is quite unusual. Moving 3 or 4 notes by whole steps is a indication that one is slipping into something that's quite deep. So darkness is showing up there as well in the music. Then comes the chorale. So the chorale, which is this very ornamented, elaborate, I think here comes the chorale. Yeah, here we go. Elaborate setting, similar to, as I said, to Jesu joy of man's desiring. The chorale comes in down here in either boys' voices or soprano-sounding voices. And is a tune. And Bach takes those first few notes and creates his accompanying line here. So on. So he is using part of the chorale in order to form his counterpoint. This is the violoncello piccolo part, which is extremely difficult even for violoncello piccolo, this small cello. Look at all the activity here that goes on, particularly here, jumping up and down on strings or between strings. And this goes along at a pretty fast tempo. Nowadays, without that instrument available, it needs to be played on a regular cello, and it increases the difficulty considerably. So as you hear this played today, cheer in your hearts the performer who's able to do this. This is 2 stanzas, so it's all repeated once again. You get to hear it twice, and it's worth hearing. Bach apparently liked this setting so much that later on in his life, what he did was take it and turned it into an organ piece. So it became a organ trio. And this was played on one manual. This was probably played on a second manual, the bass part, and then the tune was probably played in the pedal. I think that's the way it turns out. And he published it together with 5 other similar pieces where he took movements from his cantatas and turned them into organ pieces. And they were published during his lifetime, and they were known as the Schiebler chorales. And another one from that group is the one from Cantata 140, Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, Wake, wake, for night is flying. So this got extra attention from him. He must have liked it a lot, and you will too, I guarantee you. This is then followed by this very simple recitative, which I'm not even going to show you. And then comes the final aria, and we'll want to take a look at that. Let's see here. Here we go. This is what I wanted to show, where it begins. You'll recall that this particular aria, the text for this is a kind of a prayer again that God would make his face known to us again, and that he would shine on our lives in such a way that we would not walk the way of sinfulness. I'm going to show you three musical ideas here. They're each about a measure or two long. First one is 2 measures long. This is scored for full strings and will be a tenor soloist. The basic tune is one that you'll hear again, and it's sort of a tune that turns in on itself, and it's a kind of an interesting thing. And it's also characteristically constructed from rather large intervals. So there are big reaches here. It doesn't go stepwise very often. So that's one idea, and I think the textual piece here is that the soloist sings this to the words, Jesus, let your light shine. So it's this kind of prayer that goes on, but it's a fervent prayer, and I think maybe the contours of the line are of such a nature that they might suggest the light shining on us. The second idea is this series of triplets here, which, because of it being in all a breve time again, means that they move along quite quickly. Triplets, oftentimes in Bach's music, such as in the Magnificat, are a direct reference to the Holy Spirit. So it could be that Bach and the librettist both are thinking that for Jesus to shine brightly for us again in word and sacrament would mean that the Spirit would be involved. And interestingly enough, the soloist sings similar pattern to this pretty late in the aria, and the words that are sung are shine. So it's shining on us, but that shining is an activity of the Spirit. And then finally, the other pattern is this one, which is hard to imagine, but when you hear it, you'll hear it, I think you'll hear what I'm trying to say with this. This doesn't seem to move anywhere, because it keeps coming back to this B flat. It can't get away from it. And so it's a kind of a sense of permanence, a sense of being trapped. You can't get away from it. And interestingly enough, this particular pattern shows up when the soloist is singing the words that we not fall into the way of sinfulness. So that's the path of sinfulness we can't get out of, and we need the light of Christ, God's word, in order to maintain steadfastness. This is a wonderful aria, and it goes by pretty quickly, so those are some things to think about. So I'm moving back now so you can see me. And I would like to say finally, before I bid goodbye, by asking the question, how should we go about hearing this cantata? On the one hand, you can look at it as a regrettable move away from that tender story of the Emmaus disciples, a move away from a very important, powerful narrative of a post-resurrection appearance of Christ among these two disciples. And it's a move away from that to the darkness of sin and the immediacy of the end of the world, the evening of the world, August Pfeiffer would say. Is that what we would like to take away? Are we forced to take that away? Or one could say, in a more positive vein, that this is a very frank and accurate and honest affirmation of what's going on around us in this world and what was probably going on around the people in Bach's time. In that case, we look at it as an admonition, as an exhortation to be aware of what's happening, and it's not hard to do that, what with the rash of murders that have happened across the country. And the cantata then, of course, always offers a moment of hope. And that's the hope maybe that we would want to take away. Maybe it's both of those things. But be aware that this text is challenging, and it's not your usual Easter text. But it moves very quickly away from that to a recognition of what's going on around us. Musically, it's a wonderful piece, and please enjoy it. I happen to think right now that there are two things that I haven't resolved. One is, what do those trills mean? And they keep popping up in every movement. I have no evidence of this, and I've never seen it anywhere else mentioned, but my experience with looking at many, many Bach scores and playing some of them as well is that trills serve two purposes. One is that they are a musical device. For instance, they are a kind of a whistle-blowing announcement that we're coming to an end of a section, musical section, to a cadence, as we call that, and they add some excitement at that point. But they are also, they seem to be a tool or a device by which you recognize that there's a bit of life or activity somewhere and that things are not dead and or at rest. And I think that that's the way they serve here. Bleib bei uns, that is, stay with us and give us life. If you stay here, we will be active. We'll be trilling. If you leave, trills will go away, and our life is doomed. So I think that may be a thing that Bach is trying to do here. Otherwise, he was just trill happy when he was putting this together. That many voices trill together is also a little bit unique. You don't see that very often. It happens here and there, but not that often. And that makes for kind of an exciting thing as well. The other thing I failed to mention is that early on, I think I referred to the fact that Bach, a little over a week before presenting this cantata, had given his performance of the St. John Passion, the second version of it, which he had revised. And some commentators, many commentators actually, have pointed out the fact that there's a great deal of similarity between this first chorus of this cantata and the final chorus of the St. John Passion. They're both in the same key. They both have the same kind of tempo marking. So it's actually a dance, a saraband, and they have similar melodic characteristics. That may well be true. Bach had that in his mind. It was his compositional structure at the moment, and it was an easy one to fill up. If there's a theological connection there, I don't know, but one could make one easily, I suppose. And I'll leave you with that. Maybe you want to make the theological connection between remaining and staying with us and the burial song of Christ at the end of the St. John Passion. Thank you very much for listening in, and I hope you enjoy the cantata and enjoy many more to come. Bye-bye.